If Ganges is the mother, Himalayas is the father. One nurtures and nourishes, the other provides and protects. Vanita Kinra. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me this week, and for those of you who have been continuing to join every week, I do thank you most sincerely. So this week, we're going to get to our study of Central Asia at 10,000 BC, as well as get into the Indian subcontinent. This episode is going to be a little bit shorter this week. I've had a lot of technical difficulties this evening, and I'm going to make sure that this audio isn't so, low in volume. I was having some difficulties even getting it to show sound waves on Audacity, which is what I use to record. So I do apologize if this one's a little rough. I think there may be something wrong with my microphone, but I'm going to just kind of muddle on through and see how it goes. But let's just go ahead and get started. So where we left off last time, we had discussed Iran at 10,000 BC, or what is now Iran, and the numerous mountain ranges that kind of make up its geography. Now, once you get out of that area to the east, you get into the Central Asia. And to the north in that region is the stands, I guess, for lack of a better term. Places like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. Of course, these are all mostly along some, a very arid region. There are some mountains, especially towards the west, especially towards the east. There are some lakes and rivers, but for the most part, this is a very arid region. And due to that, especially with the colder climate prior to this point in time, this area was not all that well populated. I think people really didn't start showing up here till about 50,000 years ago, I think is the earliest record that we have. And that's very scant evidence. I think it wasn't. I don't think there's really firm evidence to about 40,000. So there's a very big 10,000 year gap. But once we were there, we then began to move further east, and they would eventually occupy several highlands, specifically the Tibetan Plateau. But again, that's kind of stuff for the future. I'm going to get back to that region later. But the people living in this area, they are, of course, nomadic hunter-gatherers, and the nomadic part is very important for them. They, unlike the other peoples in Asia, are having to travel much more frequently just due to the nature of the land they're living on. There's not nearly as much forage, but kind of make up for that, there are a lot of different animals living on the plain that travel in herds. Of course, further north from this location, mammoth hunts had been a big part, but they were still hunting other types of animals, things like similar to bison or buffalo, except the Asian version of those, deer, and of course horses. And horses are going to be very important coming up later, and we'll get to that again in the future. So I know that's frustrating to keep saying, but I really do want to follow kind of along as we go. But yes, this is kind of the end point, or starting point, I guess you'd say, of Central Asia's steppe provinces or steppe countries. And this will be a very important region once horses have been domesticated and travel becomes much easier, especially for herding and pastoralism. There are going to be numerous steppe peoples coming in through and out of the area. But let's go ahead and shift focus to kind of the Indian subcontinent. Now, of course, today This region is broken down between about 5 or 6 countries, depending on what you consider the region, if you want to include Myanmar or not. But when we refer to the Indian subcontinent, we are referring to today Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan, and parts of Afghanistan as well. But generally speaking, so this kind of makes up, the subcontinent kind of makes up a basically 4 giant super regions is kind of the best way to refer to it as. And to enter into this super region, or super regions I should say, there are a few options available to humans, at least at this point in time. In the northwest, you have several river valleys, mountain paths. In the northwest, the mountains are very, very rugged, but rivers have carved ways through them, and the most famous of these is the Khyber Pass, which runs from modern-day Kabul into Pakistan. And this is a very narrow, twisting passage. There are other passes, though, and many of them have seen large number of people, animals going into and out of the region for many reasons. Excuse me. So then, of course, you have to the north, you have the Himalayan mountains, which of course house Mount Everest, the tallest peak of the world. And that's where now today Nepal and Tibet lie, kind of in this region. And they both have like very deep connections to both India and China, but the mountains are so difficult to cross that there hasn't been really much direct contact between India and China, even though they both exist just on the opposite sides of these mountain ranges. Another factor to keep in mind is that because of the continued grinding between the Asian plate and the Indian plate, you get a lot of earthquakes, and there have been terrible ones. Though there is an interesting kind of point to point out about this, because of the angle that the Indian plate smashed into the Asian plate at, the mountains in the northeast are rugged, but they're not nearly as steep. So that means that people from Southeast Asia and places like Thailand and Burma and Myanmar, they have a little bit better ways to interact than the people in, say, China. Though the types of interaction they've had is different depending on the time frame and who's in charge in each location. Now, of course, India has massive coastlines, though there are very few good harbors that are secure from the weather. But eventually, as people sail more and develop different types of sails and boats, trade has become much, much easier, and people are crossing both the Indian Ocean in the west and the Bay of Bengal in the east for thousands of years. And most of the people who arrive by sea have been merchants and sailors, and there have even been some proselytizers from various faiths. Generally, sea travel in India was mostly seen as a positive, at least for most of its early history. That will begin to change, when we get to the European colonialism or colonial era. And also, due to the tilt of India, the western edge of the Indian plate has formed basically a very long mountain range called the Western Ghats. And of course, the eastern edge is lower, so that's part of the reason that's causing that range. But there is also a coastal mountain range in the east. But the Eastern Ghats are much less rugged, I guess, for lack of a better term. And in between the Eastern and Western Ghats, there's a very large plateau known as the Deccan, or the Deccan Plateau. So, most of the internal mountain ranges run west to east, and this has kind of led to, some division between the peoples living in the area. This is one of the main reasons that communications or divisions has happened between various groups living in the area. But because of monsoons and things like that, a lot of those internal mountain ranges are kind of almost closer to hills. But it does, again, cause difficulties when it comes to traversing them. Now, and in addition to mountain ranges, there are numerous river systems that are very important to the habitation of the area, as well as, civilization, or the growth of civilizations in the region. Most of the rivers in India run from west to east. There are two big major exceptions, though. One of those is, of course, the Indus River. It kind of drains from the west to the southward along mountains in what is now Afghanistan. And the other one is the Narmada River, and that runs east to west, a part of, I guess, the northern boundary of the Deccan Plateau. So, basically, these mountains and rivers make four larger regions, or four smaller regions of the Indian subcontinent, depending on what you want to refer to them as. Excuse me. So in the north, there's a flat plain that kind of encompasses the Ganges River, and then in the kind of the central part, you have the Deccan Plateau, which tends to be drier and more mountainous, and in the northwest, you have the Indus River, which runs from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. And other than that water source, a lot of that region is very dry, just due to the mountains catching, moisture and it getting frozen and that kind of stuff. But this is actually a core part of what is today Pakistan. So keep that in mind. And of course, in the southeast, you have it's much wetter, and this is very important when rice becomes a major agricultural part. So, because of India's geography, you have a very diverse mix of both wet and dry crops. This is going to be very, very important. Another important factor of living in India is the monsoons, which are hurricanes with just, you could have every day for months just seeing a huge amount of rain. But, it is very vital for a lot of the regions in the drier climes to get this rain. So it's a pain, I'm sure, and it's dangerous. Landslides, things like that are very much a danger, but to kind of live there, you have to kind of put up with it. Now because of continental drift, the Indian subcontinent is mostly in the northern hemisphere, but the Tropic of Cancer runs through the middle of it. So most of India is very hot for most of the year. I think the only regions that you might consider cold would, of course, be in the north along the Himalayas. So, that's kind of the major features of the geography. And that's going to be, again, important to keep in mind when we talk about all the kind of people and groups and kingdoms and all that stuff kind of rising and falling over the years. They're very much at the whims of where they're living. it's a very bountiful place when things are good, but when the when they're natural forces, it can be very hard. And states or civilizations that aren't prepared for that, they can very much fall due to those factors. Now, let's get to the people living there. There are quite a few people that use the term Adivasi. I think around 100 million people. And that kind of means Aboriginal. And of course, if you were to go there today, or judging by any other country, that's the largest percentage of Aboriginal people in any country, anywhere. But that term Adivasi is extremely controversial. I don't think it's been around long. I think it was like somewhere in the early 1900s that the term was invented. And essentially, people use it to kind of advocate for land rights. It helps them claim descent from original inhabitants of India who arrived tens of thousands of years earlier. The problem with this is that, well, obviously, again, they're using it to kind of take a moral and legal rights over land. And some of that was taken by outsiders. Some of that has been taken by the Indian government, especially when outsiders left. But the current Indian government, or at least parts of the current Indian government, they have some points. They don't want to admit that that the ancestors of the Adivasi were there before anyone else. The Indian government uses the term tribal, which I do think is probably a little bit better of a description, because a lot of these people do carry on a traditional lifestyle, especially there's a lot of people living in the forest. Of course, the problem with that is it's kind of become a pejorative, like he's a forest dweller. So it's a very difficult kind of thing to deal with, because it's very possible that the ancestors for non-tribal people, most of them have been in the region probably around the same time. It's just a question of where exactly and how much. And they developed their own civilization. They just changed how they were living. They didn't continue that kind of hunting and gathering lifestyle. Eventually, they will develop their own form of agricultural and sedentary society. So it's a very difficult kind of topic, and I can see points from both sides. As most rational people can. In most of these situations, there are points for or against stuff. But regardless, the Adivasi are a very large part of the Indian population, but they are not all homogenous. There are different groups. Of course, there are quite a number of different tribes. The Indian government's right in that they are not all one people. They are a number of different people, and they all have either their own languages. They didn't even use this. I think most of them didn't even have any kind of script until very recently, and there are some that still don't have their own scripts. So there's no written historical records on their end. Of course, the sedentary societies, they of course refer to them, but it's always kind of well, not necessarily worrisome, but it's always a difficulty if you just have outsiders referring to a people. There's always something lost in translation. There's always rituals or communication that you're not really getting the deeper meaning, or you're getting the surface level events, and you're not understanding exactly why these people do things or did things the way they did them. And that's always a danger when you just look at an outsider's perspective of a group, especially when there are conflicts between those groups. But that being said, the Adivasis, they do have, or at least most of them have, very fleshed out oral traditions, cultural traditions, especially when it comes to things like religions. I think there's one group that basically they kind of recount the creation of, they have their own creation myth. It's very distinct from, Hindu creation myth or Buddhist creation myth or anything like that. And we'll get to those people in the future, again, because at this point, they're definitely, their ancestors are living in the region, but we don't really know how they're divided. When it comes to DNA testing, a lot of, especially in northern regions of India, it's hard to do because of the environment and how hot it can be. In certain places, there's not a very good record of getting ancient remains or older remains to test. And of course, cremation is a major factor for a lot of these tribes, and not just tribes, but established faiths. Hindus, that's a very important practice for certain for certain sects of Hinduism. So getting ancient DNA is very difficult, and testing that is hard to do. There have been some studies, and I know there's a major study going on right now that hopefully they'll be putting out results. There's a number of things I'd like to see from that. But we'll dive into that in future episodes when we get to kind of the Harappan or Sarasvati civilizations. But, of course, DNA evidence is not the only thing being tested. A lot of anthropologists and linguists, of course, they would like to kind of cross-reference each other and the DNA stuff, and that's always important. I think anytime you can use multiple schools thought to kind of verify and test things, and see what pans out and what doesn't, it's extremely important. But the Adivasi peoples are they relied very heavily on forests, and India was originally much more forested than it is today, but they practiced kind of a form of slash and burn agriculture, or it's also known as swidden agriculture. But that kind of changes the nature of the the ecology of the area, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I know I've been saying, this is going to be important. It is important, even at the time I'm referring to it, but it's kind of hard to extrapolate, lay out how it's important at this point in time, because, again, a lot of this stuff, we're just beginning to see, evidence of it beginning. It won't really factor in until basically it's already too late. At least when it comes to things like deforestation, that doesn't help when you have so much rain. You're losing these root systems that kind of absorb and lessen the impact of that. And the type of agriculture they practice is extremely damaging to the environment. So, yeah, it's a very complicated issue. But I hope when we begin to study specific groups, I can kind of get more in depth on this, because that's what I want to do eventually. But I do feel like it's important to kind of lay out who the big players are, at least at this point in time. And that being said, it's time to go a little bit further south to what is now the nation of Sri Lanka, formerly referred to as Ceylon. There are a people here known as the Vedar, or Vidar, or Veda, depending on who's referring to them. I think they're also known as the Wanayalaito. and they are kind of the earliest group, or at least supposedly the earliest. There's a lot of kind of archaeological evidence with the oldest remains found in the region, and the a very small number of people living there today. I think there's only about 7,000, at most, of these people still living in Sri Lanka. But they have been there for at least 40,000 years, I believe, and they're very interesting kind of makeup genetically. They are similar to other Austronesians, but there is evidence that they have also interbred with kind of, if not a Neanderthal, a very close relative of Neanderthal, which is odd, because that's so far south, that's not really where you would think of Neanderthal. Or at least their skeletons show some Neanderthal similarities. But, so they're different even from other Austronesians. And it is unfortunate that there are not that many of them. It's not, but I will say it's not necessarily that they were, kind of pushed out by everyone else. They have still been living their lifestyle, and of course there's always going to be some push and pull from, hunter-gatherers and pastoralists and urban dwellers and that kind of thing. But I think from what I can gather, a lot of their numbers, they were never a huge group. And they were just kind of competed, I guess, for lack of a better term, with the people the other peoples living in Sri Lanka. They still practice some of their traditional beliefs, very animistic religion, I think is the term. But they do have some elements that they've kind of, syncretized with Buddhism and Hinduism. So they're definitely one group that we can say for sure has existed kind of on their own. And how they got to Sri Lanka is very interesting. Because of the way that the weather works in the area, it would be a very dangerous boat ride. It'd be possible. But it's also possible that they crossed what's known as Adam's Bridge or Rama's Bridge or the Rama Setu. And what this is basically a group of shoals between the tip of India and Sri Lanka itself. And apparently this will, every few years or so that this due to the sea levels, it kind of makes it easier to cross almost on foot, really. Or it make it a lot easier. So I think today it can't be done. But there is a ferry, I guess, kind of running to the north of that region. So, I think this is a good place to stop it. Episode, it's almost been 30 minutes, which I'm surprised I was able to do it. I do want to thank everyone for listening. I know this is a rougher episode, and I do apologize for that. I might have to get a new mic. We'll have to see. And I hope I didn't get off on too many tangents. So, again, thank you all for listening. You can reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com, or you can direct message me on Twitter. Next week, we will be, of course, continuing in Asia, and we'll be moving east to what is now Southeast Asia. And then we may also get to kind of the southern part of China as well. I'm still working on the script. I'm about halfway through. I'm gonna have to time it and see. But hopefully there will be no technical issues next week, and I will be much less frazzled and better rested, because it is getting a little late here in the U.S. So I do, again, thank everyone for listening. Please reach out if you have any questions or any constructive feedback. And I hope everyone has a great day. Goodbye.